Buenas tardes and welcome. Bienvenidos to today's conversation with Eduardo Chavez. Today's event is part of the month-long celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. My name is Dixiana Chavez. My pronouns are she, her, ella, and I am the president of the Latino Faculty and Staff Association, also known as LFSA. And in my role here at UT Dallas, I am an assistant director in the Office of Undergraduate Education. Now, before we get our conversation started with Eduardo, I do want to do a land acknowledgement. So before we begin this program, we would like to start by acknowledging the history and legacy of colonization. UT Dallas stands on land originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche people. We recognize the history of UT Dallas begins with the forced removal of the indigenous people through the legacy of colonization. Now, before we get started, I really wanted to just share what LFSA, the Latino Faculty Staff Association, is all about. So what are we? What is the mission? So our mission is to build community among the Latino faculty and staff by empowering employees at all levels to network, advance personally and professionally, and to foster an inclusive workplace. We do this through meetings, socials, lunches, some loteria games, and through even events like tonight. On behalf of LFSA, I welcome you to this evening's event for Hispanic Heritage Month celebrations at the University of Texas at Dallas. Now, again, before we get started, I also have some sponsors that we really want to be thankful and grateful for. I really want to thank the Office of Equity, Education, and Administration, also the Office of Vice President and Chief of Staff for allowing us and being our sponsors for tonight's event. A huge special thank you to our executive sponsor, Dr. Rafael Martin and Raul Hinojosa, for their unending support of LFSA. And now I want to introduce to you all and welcome Bruce August Jr., Director of the Multicultural Center, to give us some welcoming words on behalf of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. Welcome, Bruce.
All right. Good evening, comments. Buenos tardes. My name is Bruce August Jr., I serve as Director of the Multicultural Center underneath the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at UT Dallas. So on behalf of Dr. Yvette Pearson, Vice President of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, affectionately known as ODI, we would like to welcome you to this program tonight. We just believe in equitable opportunities for all of our students, faculty, and staff, and community members here at UT Dallas. So in order to create a great culture, a campus culture where everyone is physically and psychologically safe, valued, and respected, we partner with plenty of people on campus, including academic schools, administrative units, educational programs, student organizations, and community stakeholders to provide a wealth of activities, education, learning, knowledge building, knowledge gathering, and celebration, as we're doing right now during Hispanic Heritage Month. So on our campus, we are celebrating Hispanic Heritage Month in a grand way, and our theme for the month is Unidos, inclusivity for a stronger nation. So this year's theme encourages us to ensure that all voices are represented and welcome to help build a stronger community and also a stronger nation. And so I encourage you to check out the Office of Diversity website, our socials. We're thriving. We're excited to be here tonight with LFSA and looking forward to a great conversation with Eduardo. So thank you all for your time. I'm gonna get out of your way and get to the main event. I could talk all day about what we do, but we are happy to be here. Enjoy. I'm going to turn it over to Dixie.
Yes, muchísimas gracias, Bruce. Thank you so much for your help, heartfelt welcome. And now we are getting closer to this conversation with Eduardo. Let me introduce to you our esteemed moderator for today, who will also be going back and forth in asking these questions. This is Eduardo. He will be conversing and, of course, reading off the questions that you have as you watch the film Hailing Cesar. So now I want to introduce to you Dr. Nakvi. He is the program head for the Masters of Arts in Interdisciplinary Studies and is an assistant professor of instruction in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies here at UT Dallas. He teaches courses in the American Studies program, including American Studies for the 21st century, the 1960s, and the immigrant experience post-1945. Dr. Nakvi is a scholar of race, immigration, sports, and Islam in America. His book, Chicago Muslims and the Transformation of American Islam, explores the intersection of Black power politics, immigration, and Islamic community formation in Chicago during the 1960s and 1970s. He received his PhD in history from Carnegie Mellon University, a master's in education from Northwestern University, and a BA in history and economics from New York University. Dr. Nakvi, please take it away and introduce our esteemed key speaker for the night, Eduardo Chavez.
Thank you so much. It was very kind of you. Very excited to be able to be here with all of you today. We have a really special guest with us, and so I'm going to introduce to you Eduardo Chavez. He's the grandson of Cesar Chavez, as well as being a true Renaissance man himself. You know, an athlete, an actor, a filmmaker, and an activist who's really been able to help educate us on a lot of things that are happening right now, as well as things from the past through his wonderful documentary, which you all have seen, Hailing Cesar. And so, you know, with no further ado, I thought we could start off with a conversation where we get a chance to ask Eduardo some important questions about this really important work. So as we do that, I'm going to just ask, you know, if you have a question in the audience and you want to, something really you'd like Eduardo to be able to address, please, you know, put it into the Q&A, and we're going to take those questions as we go. You know, so I have some questions that I'm going to ask as well, and you know, we can have a bit of a free-flowing conversation. It doesn't have to be too rigid here. And so, if you've got any questions, please put them in. I'll read them out as they are available, and you know, we'll hopefully have a really nice time for the next hour or so. So let's begin. I wanted to start us off just maybe big picture, right? Because I watched this documentary and I had so many feelings and thoughts, and it was really inspiring. And I just wanted to start off, Eduardo, asking you big picture, like, what do you think is the ultimate takeaway for your own life, having done this project? Like, what has it done for you, and where does it kind of point you in the future?
Yeah, first of all, just super excited to be here. So just I want to thank everyone at UT Dallas for inviting me. Love doing events like this and just kind of getting the word out about my film and connecting with young people and people that have watched my film. So yeah, big picture, it's a great question. The film, like any creative endeavor that I think most people can attest to when they start that creative journey, you really kind of have these almost short-sighted goals. Initially, we were trying to make a coherent film that an audience could see. And then it's that beautiful abstract idea that happens where audience members kind of immerse themselves in the film, and it really kind of takes its own life. And that's really what happened with this film. This film has been such a amazing opportunity for me as a person, just as a human being, to be able to experience this, have this very intimate experience with my culture, with my own father, with my grandfather who's deceased, and really just kind of my history as a Mexican American, as a Chicano person in this country. So big picture, I never would have imagined that all of these things would have happened with this film and it would be such a success. But really, I think it's just a testament to I think it's just a testament to our, the Latinx population in this country and how we are, as young people, really all people, we're just kind of really craving this type of content when it comes to identity. I think we have such a large population of Latinx people in this country, and for the first time, I think we are viewing ourselves as massive contributors to this country on all different fronts. And I think my grandfather's story is it's a very impactful one. And it's kind of one of the first times in history that Latinx people were kind of pushed to the forefront and seen as people that had a lot of power. And there was a lot of empowerment that has come from that movement. And big picture, I think we got very lucky that we were able to make a film to just keep that moving. And I think that one of my biggest takeaways is really just seeing my grandfather's movement and seeing myself as just hopefully, all of us as Latinx people can be empowerers of our own culture and kind of push ourselves forward to show really the world of how important our culture is to this country and really the contributions that we've made. I think that my grandfather is obviously in the history of this country, Latinx people, as Latinx people go, one of the very important figures, but really he was just the beginning. He kind of opened the doors and opened the pathways as kind of a very, it was our stylistic choice. The very last words of the film were that, my grandfather showed us the way, and now we have to follow that path. So that's really kind of been my takeaway. And any way that I can work on creative projects and connect with people and kind of just build this higher consciousness when it comes to being a decent human being and looking out for a neighbor, looking out for a community before yourself, then I feel like we're taking my grandfather's message and putting it into action. So we've been very lucky and just really really privileged to be able to work on this project and share it with audiences.
Yeah, thank you. That hearing your response to that, one thing that I think you spoke to, which really resonates with me as someone who is really interested in immigration and immigration stories and continuation of these kind of familial stories and the legacy of cultures. Obviously your experience is very unique, right? Very few people have a grandfather who's one of the most famous icons of the United States. However, there are lots of immigrant Americans or first generation, second generation kids of immigrants who could relate to some elements of the story. And one thing that really struck me was, you really put this out there very boldly at the beginning of the film that your upbringing and your lifestyle growing up is so different from, your grandfather's and even your father's, right? And I was curious, how did you kind of, grapple with that in terms of understanding your place in the story and your place in, say, the continuation of that work?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think when I was younger, I think it was very difficult for me to place myself, like you said, in this entire story. Just to put it very simply, my grandfather started his life as a farm worker, and then he essentially quit working in the fields to then organize farm workers. My own father grew up working in the fields. He worked in the fields starting at, I think in the film we had that conversation, 12, 13 years old was the first time he ever, did a day of work in the fields. And for me, obviously, that was such a different reality from how I grew up. So at a young age, it kind of made my place in this story when it comes to my family's history. It made it a little bit, the waters were a little bit murky. I almost felt like I don't have a place in that moment because I don't know that struggle. And it wasn't until I became older, I matured and kind of gave myself the space to understand that no matter how you grow up or where you grow up, we as Americans, and especially as Latinx people in this country, whether you're Mexican American, whether you're just a Latino person who's lived in this country, or you're an immigrant, we're all, regardless of our upbringing, deeply connected to this history. My grandfather's movement, even if he was not my grandfather and I was just Eduardo Chavez, not related to Cesar Chavez, the work that he did, would be extremely important to myself as a Mexican American person. He was a figure of empowerment. So it wasn't until I kind of started going back and kind of learning my family's history, kind of really familiarizing myself with what it was that my grandfather did. The difficult part of that education for myself was that I was conditioned from a very young age, despite my grandfather being this historical figure, I was conditioned to really almost put him in a box, in the sense that I think that a lot of history has put him in a box to make him a liberator of farm workers, make him a union organizer for farm labor. And by trade and by profession, that's what he was. And it wasn't until I met so many people along the way making this film and talking to people that marched with my grandfather and people that volunteered for the union, is that I was able to see my grandfather in a different light, in a larger picture. And I was able to see him as an empowerer of Latinx people in this country. Kind of a person that shows that he was a person, a public figure that was doing very good for the world, very good for Latinx people in this country, and he was empowering everyone along with him. That idea of, if he can do it, I can do it too. And if he is showing that farm workers have human dignity and they have self-worth, then we all win, and we all have that human dignity. We can all view ourselves as very valuable people. And so as time went on and I started to kind of uncover this family history of mine, I started seeing my grandfather in a broader perspective. The picture became a lot broader as a figure of Latino empowerment. Then that's when I kind of saw myself in the picture as someone that could just carry this legacy along and do it my own way. I will never be able to have the same experience that my grandfather had or my own father had, growing up in extreme poverty and having to work in the fields to be able to, feed myself and my family. And it wasn't until I became older that I figured out that for me to do my part to keep this legacy alive, that is insignificant, that I can keep the legacy alive and I can do it my own way, have my own fresh, authentic take on it. And I think that's really, when I found filmmaking and found this art of storytelling, I found the vehicle. I always wanted to be someone growing up with this big legacy. I always felt some pressure, obviously, to fulfill the shoes, but I knew I had to do it my own way. And it was not until I found this medium, this vehicle of filmmaking, that I thought, this is probably the most valuable way that I can continue my grandfather's legacy and reach new audiences and do it from, my own perspective. And I think when that authenticity met the timing and the maturity, that's when I think I was able to become really comfortable in my own skin and be able to speak in settings like this and be able to see this legacy as a platform. That's a very beautiful thing to hopefully empower other Latinx people and all young people. So it really was a slow process. And I really, I owe a lot to my parents for giving me the space, to never putting pressure on me to have to follow a certain path. It was always about, your job is to your job is to fill and continue the legacy by being the best human you can be, by being someone that thinks of others before yourself, and being, be as selfless as you can be. And when it came to specifics of how am I going to grow this big picture, filmmaking was really that vehicle. And I believe that art is just such a powerful medium to influence and to change people's perspectives. And that's really been my journey, and kind of hopefully pushing this narrative forward of all the themes that when my grandfather was organizing that are as important today as they were then.
That's wonderful. Yeah, there are so many interesting aspects of what you're talking about in terms of the universalness of that experience. I really appreciate you being able to say, that despite everyone else's position in the story being very different from yours, there are these kind of larger takeaways. To some degree, I'd also love to, probe maybe some of the particular aspects of this, because I think, there are elements of this film that I don't think maybe any of us can relate to in some ways. And I think those are also really striking and interesting. One of the things that really I found very striking through the film was when you would discuss, when you would tell people who your grandfather was and the way they would react to you, and the way in which they felt like they were part of that story and they knew that story in a way that you were demonstrating to them and very upfront with them about how, oh, I don't necessarily know more than you do, or I don't necessarily have more connection there. How can you maybe talk to the audience a little bit about that? Like, what was that experience like to have like this critical part of your own identity maybe understood by others more than yourself, and then having to kind of go through it so publicly, like this wasn't like, I got to sit in my house and, just reflect on it. You really put yourself out there and you kind of talked about that experience.
Yeah, 100%. It's always something that I get asked a lot, and it's very difficult to articulate what that experience was like growing up. To put it bluntly, I was always, as a young person, I was always, if I was put into a new scenario, whether it was going from 3rd grade to 4th grade, or I was just joining the basketball team or the soccer team, or doing whatever any like young kid growing up is doing, I would be introduced as myself, my own being, and within a day, 24 hours, it would come up that his grandfather is Cesar Chavez. And as a young person, it was difficult because I didn't see my grandfather in the same light as the public sees him. And so I always felt like some of my identity was being diminished and being overshadowed by someone that I didn't really know because he passed away when I was 1.5 years old, and B, someone that I feel like had such a different experience than I did. I'll always look up to my grandfather for being a person that really changed the scope of humanity forever, and one of those, once in X amount of years type figures. But yeah, it was very difficult as a young person. And I've talked to my own father about this, saying that it's very difficult we almost have two different views. We carry, as being someone in the family close to this historical figure, we carry the figure that we view as as I call him in our family, my Tati Cesar, and then we hold another lens, which is the public lens. And unfortunately, because of my grandfather passing away when I was only 1.5 years old, much of my relation to him was all through the public lens. It was through holidays, it was through street signs, movies, that kind of thing. The personal nature of the relationship with my grandfather wasn't really there. So it wasn't until really I went on this journey to make this film that I had to kind of build it myself. And obviously I didn't have my grandfather in the flesh to do it with him, but I figured the closest and next best thing would be to go through my father, who was his eldest son. And I think in having these conversations, going to these places, being with my father in these very, very close-knit historical places and talking to a lot of people, I think it really opened up my eyes and really changed my perspective. And it made me really soften up for a lot of a little bit of animosity I had towards growing up with always having that shadow. It really softened me up because I really started to understand the magnitude and the weight of what my grandfather did. And I really, as I've gotten older, I really see it as it's a very beautiful thing to be able to share a family member with the world. It's very beautiful. It's very, very few people can say that. And I think I'm very privileged to be able to have that. And again, I will always have those two different lenses, and my lens is very, very small with my grandfather, the personal lens. It's all really what I've heard about through my own father, and it's the things that many of the public doesn't know, that my grandfather was a very big aficionado of tennis. He used to love watching tennis, and that his favorite food was Indian food, and that he used to always chew sunflower seeds, and these little things. That's my scope of personal with my grandfather. And the rest is kind of what the public sees. But what I feel very lucky and privileged to have done in making this film is to get those personal tidbits, but from other people that knew my grandfather. And it just makes me feel, closer to history, which is a very beautiful thing. It's something I've never felt before. It's a very important, that was a very important time in history. And it really is, you know, history is like an indicator. It's like a compass to where the world is going. And I think I feel very privileged to have had that experience. As far as putting this very intimate experience for the public to see, that was really kind of something that was difficult. If you can see in some of those scenes, and even a lot of scenes that didn't make it into the film, I still to this day have a little bit of difficulty telling people who my grandfather is when it's out of context. Obviously events like this, it's part of the context, so it's similar, it's more seamless, but when it's out of context, it always does feel a little bit difficult. I've gotten more comfortable with that, especially because this film, you know, I chose to put it in the public eye like that. And I think the main reason that I did that was it really goes beyond, like being a Latinx person. It goes beyond social justice, beyond identity. It really is just like about vulnerability. I really wanted to be able to show, and especially to young people and young Latinx people, that when we can open ourselves up, whether it's something that is going to be seen by one person, or you're opening yourself up to a family member or in a personal relationship, that good things happen and you grow as a person. And so that vulnerability was something that I was just, it was difficult, but I figured for this film to be the best that it can be, it needs to be very authentic, and I need to be as open as possible, because I think people, at least in my eyes, whenever I see any sort of art made, movies, read books, I really latch on to like authenticity. When someone's being really honest, it really is something that I'm drawn towards. So I hope people and audience members were drawn to that. And also, when it comes to terms of identity, I know speaking to a lot of young Latinx people, being a Latinx person, whether you're Gen Z or millennial in the United States, the culture and the tide has shifted so much over the last 10, 20 years that it is very easy to lose your footing in the sense of where you fit into this entire puzzle. And so I kind of wanted it to be vulnerable and be open for people to, you know, kind of show them that, look, this is the grandson of this iconic figure, arguably one of the most iconic Latinx figures in our history of this country. And even his own grandson is, you know, doesn't have his 2 feet under him when it came to understanding where he fit in. And that's just a very like universal thing that we can all attest to, that anyone who has been young or is a young person now is going through that, just a really young person finding their way in the world. And I think that was kind of like the real human element of this film that I hope people gravitated towards. So it was definitely difficult. Before this film, I didn't really view myself as someone that was very outspoken about these type of themes and issues that we covered in the film. But if a few people watched it and were able to relate to it, then I think, you know, as a filmmaker, then we kind of did our job.
We have some fantastic questions coming in from the Q&A. So I'm going to turn to a couple of those. One of them asks, you know, did you let the farm workers know who you were in the movie, you know, towards the end? I know early on you said that, you know, that you hadn't revealed to them. How did they treat you in this process?
Yeah, good question. So I actually never did. I never did tell them who my grandfather was. The cameras were obviously, it was something that we couldn't hide. So, you know, showing up there, they obviously knew that I was looking at me and like how I was picking the fields, that I was much slower than them. So they knew that this was not something that I had done before. We did tell the workers, I did tell the workers that we were filming a documentary and it was about farm workers, but nothing about in relation to who my grandfather was. That was, I thought about it many times when we were in the fields. I'd wake up and we had cameras rolling, and I never, luckily, just stylistically, the camera was never, despite what it looks like when you're watching the film, I really got lost in those days. I sometimes would forget that the cameras were even like rolling, and I just didn't. I didn't think that it would necessarily add anything, or even if I did tell any of the workers, that it would be something that we put in the film. I did keep in touch with some of those workers initially a couple years after the film, and I did send a couple of them the film, so they got it that way because they wanted to see it. And I was just really, they were very, one of the most like touching things that happened that didn't make it into the film was talking after. I remember it was like probably just through Facebook with some of the workers that I worked with, and they were just very proud that before they had any context of what the film was about, they were just very proud that the work that they do was going to be shown on some sort of screen. And at that time, we nor them had any idea of what magnitude this film would be, kind of the platform it would have. But they were just, I think it's just it kind of shows the kind of the societal kind of place where farm workers are today, because they were so proud that the cameras were there and that we were showcasing the work that they do. And I remember they kept on telling me like, yeah, I'm so happy that you're doing this, because so many people think that us as undocumented people, that we're here and there's all these different narratives. I'm very happy that we can show people how difficult this work is and that we're human. We captured some of those conversations, and that it's very easy over this political issue. It's really of immigration. It's about human beings, really. It's not about policy. It's about human beings and families and real important lives. But yeah, humanizing these workers that I worked with and became friendly with, it was something that I was never sure, like film stylistically, how we were gonna like include that, but it just flowed very, very nicely, and I became very friendly with them. And as the film showed, they invited me into their own homes, and were just the generosity of heart was really off the charts, and something that made me feel very proud to be a part of the legacy that I have with my grandfather.
Thank you for answering that. Yeah, oh my gosh, I think your answers are just really sparking people. There's so many questions that are coming through in the chat. I'm going to go through some of them in order, because I know people have been waiting, with some ideas. So there's one here that says, talking about, when you were talking about kind of trying to understand the complexity of the story and the complexity of Cesar Chavez and his legacy. There's one that says, though Cesar Chavez was for farm work freedom, how did you navigate media as the farm workers who later talked about racism toward immigrants and abusing the workers? So I guess the question is really asking about, like, how did you grapple with this complexity of the figure of your grandfather, and racial conflict that emerged and immigration issues and those kinds of things? How did you kind of grapple with that when you were putting this together?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. So I had many. This film was, obviously I'm the director and the subject, but like much of the heavy lifting of this film was done by my producing partner, Cyrus. And Cyrus and I we had so many long conversations about kind of like the scope, like what is this film, like what's going to be the takeaway? And there were so many different ways we could take this, and it was filmed right around the time that Trump was running, and then he came into office. And I think it would have been, I don't want to say easy, but it would have been, from a stylistic and filmmaking perspective, it would have been very, I would say it would have been very A to B to C to make this film very political. It could have been done very easily, especially given the nature of the history of my grandfather, and then it coming full circle with a president that's like spewing a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric and is making the immigrants that really are like the backbone of this country, making them have to live in fear and in the shadows. So that was we could have taken that, and then taken that route. And after like a lot of conversations, we really just decided to make this film. Like we kept on making, like we would go back to making this film about like empathy. That was really the main. We wanted to make this film. I felt like putting politics in this film would have kind of like tarnished it for me. Politics are obviously they're very dirty. It's very messy what happens in Washington, and it's obviously very important because people's lives and policy affects people's lives, everyday lives, very much. But this was a film about humanity. It was a film about people, and it was a film that hopefully people could relate to. And so we really just stuck with like keeping this about human beings and about relationships. And that's why I think that that's why I really think that the film has resonated with people. I know some people are apolitical and some people don't get involved, and that could have, from the perspective of just eyeballs on the film, some people see, oh, this is a political documentary, I'm not going to watch, because some people are on different sides of the aisle. That really wasn't the reasoning behind it. It was just about making a film that could breathe. And I feel like leaving politics out of it and making this about human beings is kind of was the best take that we could have. So I'm glad that we took that avenue.
Yeah, kind of on that question, there's another sort of related question. If you're talking about, because you're saying the focus in many ways is more about the people themselves and their experience, and so much of the film is dedicated to you getting to know these workers who are doing this job currently today, right? And one question that one of the community members has asked is, have you thought about doing a second film that maybe is taking a more historical look of the perspective of these farm workers that personally knew him and worked with him? Or is your interest more towards, hey, the way we can apply the lesson to today? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think when it comes to how I see my future as like a creative person, as a filmmaker, I understand the implications that come with making your first project about your grandfather, my grandfather being the historical person. I understand, and I do get a lot of questions, and a lot of people make assumptions that maybe this will be kind of the scope that I take for all of my projects, and that it's going to be directly related to farm workers or to my grandfather. And I don't really think that necessarily the kind of the avenue I want to take. I see this first film as something that was, we were lucky enough to capture a moment in time. And this was myself being a person, out of college in their mid-20s, really trying to understand their place in the world. And then you throw in the context of who my grandfather is and kind of what my family's history means to this country. That was the film that we were able to make. As far as what I see my vision for future projects is, I see my life as a person has been enriched so much since I was able to really ground myself in my family's history. And, this idea of identity is so fascinating to me, and especially in this country that we live in the United States, how multicultural it is. There's so many different young people that have different identities and see themselves in this big puzzle in different ways. And I really just feel like I've grown so much since I was able to, kind of retrace my family's history. And I feel so much more comfortable in my own skin. And I'm able to see this family history I have as a platform that I can use for so much good. Something that I used to see when I was a lot younger as a shadow that felt like a literal weight on my shoulders has been really freed, and now I see it as just a tremendous opportunity. And the ideas have started flowing, and I just want to make content and make films and do things that hopefully people that see my stuff can hopefully relate to. And I think that's why we took that's why we took this approach to making this film. I really just want to be kind of, I want to really empower, Latinx individuals. There's a lot of people that have helped me along the way. get to this point as far as it comes to, we're just professionally talking, that you know, I would love to be one day in a place where then I can be someone that can empower a young Latinx person, a young person of color that can tell their stories. You know, we have to, as people of color in this country, we have to tell our stories. We have to keep our history alive, because that's really kind of that moving forward, that's what really keeps our, it's kind of like our compass. I've really seen my kind of diving into my family's history as to really see that as kind of like a compass for how I view my life. And there's so many young people of color that are in the same position and are grappling with those issues of identity. And, you know, if I can be in the place of privilege down the line to empower them to tell their stories, whatever avenue, whatever medium, doesn't need to be film or anything even creative, just to be able to tell their stories, I think then that would be like, you know, the biggest accomplishment I could make.
On that note, you know, one of the questions that is in here is asking, the question says, this is an amazing first film. Do you have other film ideas? And I thought maybe I could add to that even, you know, hearing you talk about how important this idea of identity is, and how that's like where I think you, if I'm hearing you correctly, is where you feel like your place as a filmmaker is. Not necessarily historian, not necessarily a person who wants to be just focused in on, you know, your grandfather's legacy or just the legacy of the particular labor movements, you know, but someone who's really interested in this identity at large. You know, thinking of it in those terms, other film ideas, I mean, are you thinking about doing stories that are fiction or mostly nonfiction, or about young people generally? I mean, what type of stories are you grappling with? Are there any projects you're working on right now?
Yeah, so, you know, that's always the thing. What's the next move? That's always the golden ticket. And if you're lucky, you have the first move, and as you're wrapping up the first move, the second move is in here. And you know, to be completely honest, it's very much so, as I think a lot of people can attest to this. The first time that you do something, whether it's you kind of like, you embark on a journey and you succeed, but it's the first time, you know, we all have, as, and I it's just kind of the second time coming to this, because I had that first kind of like my younger days as an athlete, as a golfer. And as an athlete, you're constantly, and I've heard professional athletes talk about this all the time, no matter how good they are, it could be Tiger Woods, Tom Brady, you know, Cristiano Ronaldo, whoever your favorite athlete is, everyone battles this fear of failure. Always. It's constant. It used to happen to me as a golfer. No matter how good I would play in competitions and tournaments, you're always in the back of your mind grappling with that fear of, what if it doesn't work out? And so, yeah, I've definitely had that cross my mind of like, you know, this was the first film. I always tell people the stars aligned for this film to come true. They really beautifully aligned, from all the people that worked on it, from the time and place I was in my life. The stars align. And I think what I would tell a lot of people that have never made a film, I would say, is that that's for a film to come together, to make just to make a film from point A to point B, so many things have to fall into place. And that happened so beautifully to make this film. So I definitely have had a lot of ideas of things that I would really want to pursue, but I keep going back to this idea of this was like the perfect moment in time. This was the perfect film. And as time has passed, now I'm more in the mindset of, you know, if you wait too much, you're always waiting for that perfect, like untouched, just like beautiful project. Sometimes that doesn't come by. So I've had to like keep my creative ideas flowing, and I've, you know, started to find other avenues that I can express myself in. So one of the projects I have that are not film related is I have a podcast that I started. I think now we're close to 25 episodes in, so we've been going for a little bit. It's called the We Are Latinx podcast. That is really just about uplifting our Latinx culture, kind of showing people in this country that as Latinos, we're not a monolith, that we all have different experiences. And I really like talking to other Latinx people and talking to them about how their culture kind of identifies their work, which is really like the baseline of what my film was about. It was like me understanding my culture and my identity, and then that really informed this film that I made. So yeah, that podcast has been really interesting to, you know, meet and talk to a lot of really cool people. That's been one way to keep the creativity flowing. Yeah, so the plug is We Are Latinx podcast, and it's on Spotify and Apple. That's one. And then also I have lightly been working on, and it's going to pick up a little bit more, is actually adapting this same story, but tweaking it a little bit into a children's book. And I think this film, I believe, has been really just it was such a privilege to make and to share it with audiences. And I want to now share it with basically the same age of kids that were in that last scene where I'm doing that exercise with the students in the school garden, teaching them about my grandfather. And I would really love to make this into a book to kind of plant that seed of asking those questions to very, very young, whether it's kindergarten, first, second, elementary school. It's never too early to ask those questions of like, what does it mean to be a Latinx person? Who are some people that look like me that have succeeded and have kind of showed us the path? Obviously, when we made this film, it was made by myself, you know, person in their mid-20s, and that was kind of the scope. But I'd really love to hopefully get published, this children's book, to kind of introduce this idea to very more elementary school aged kids. And I've had many elementary school teachers, when people ask me what projects I'm working on, say that, you know, this would be amazing for my kids, because as far as my kids, that they're students, because you know, this history is unfortunately slowly getting lost by younger and younger people. And I think if all goes well and I can, you know, adapt this into that children's book, I think hopefully, you know, some young kids can get inspired by the story. And I'm always amazed. I remember one quick story I can tell, you know, within this context was, I was invited to Phoenix, Arizona, maybe last year, working with an organization called Latinos in Action. And they are an organization that is like in about 18 states. It's like a high school curriculum that teaches like leadership to high school students, Latinx students, and it's part of it's like for course credit in those states. And I was invited to Phoenix, and I just assumed that it was high school students that I'd be presenting to. And when I showed up to this school in Phoenix, I looked and I was like, either I'm getting older or these kids look so young. And I asked the person that was kind of, you know, taking me around, what grade is this? And like, oh, it's middle school. And they were going to see the movie, and I was like, oh man, I wonder, sixth grade. I'm trying to remember where I was mentally in sixth grade. And I'm thinking, look, what if they don't understand this? And some of the most like hard-hitting questions I was asked, things that, you know, they took away things from this film that I hadn't taken away. They were giving me new ideas of how to see this film, and I was really like taken aback. And when that happened a couple of years ago, that's when I said, you know, I completely underestimated the really the like capacity that a sixth grader today has. Because I know when I was in sixth grade, if I would have been presented a film like the one I made, I think it probably would have gone over my head. But that's when I was really inspired. I was like, okay, let's do something and try and adapt this so then these young students can get that ball rolling, because it's really never too young. I see all these questions that I was asking myself about my family and our history and about being just a brown person in America. And I think it's never too young to ask those questions. You lay a stronger foundation. So, and then aside from that, I also have just a lot of other passions that are aside from, you know, this kind of tone and of social justice and identity. And I really would love to make some of those projects. I love sports. I really would love to do something in the realms of some sort of like docu-series about golf and travel around the world and showing kind of audiences how far that game has spread to the four corners. You know, but I'm constantly thinking of new ideas, and it's just a balance of staying patient and then finally just, picking one, I guess.
That's some of the stuff you're talking about here, I think really dovetails nicely. I'm going to kind of combine a few of the questions that are looking at some very similar kind of things. I know you had mentioned earlier that when you made this documentary, you didn't intend it to be like very political. It's not a political documentary necessarily. But one of the things that really struck me about it when I was watching it, and it seems like many of the people in the audience as well, they're really struck by some of the politics of it too, and they're interested in some of the implications of it. So, if you can bear with us and talk a little bit of politics, I think it would be really helpful.
Of course.
One of the things that is really striking in the film is, this scene where you go to Sacramento and you're fighting for, the workers to get overtime pay, and you're continuing on this struggle that's been an ongoing struggle for years. One of the commentators that we have has written in that, one thing that's really striking about Gen Z, as you were just talking about them, is how vocal they are about fighting for what they believe is right. There's also someone who's asked about, to what extent do your views and your position in this fight as an activist, are they in line with what your grandfather's views were and their politics and all of that as well? And so, I was curious, you went through this experience, you got involved directly in the fight, and, do you have sort of these long-term, takeaways or advice that you could give about how, this struggle can be continued for people in Gen Z? And to what degree, is there complexity in some of the ways in which the politics work on this in terms of your own thoughts compared to, say, oh, I can't just pick up a book from 1975 and know exactly what you're thinking, right? Or can I? So that's part of what I think some of the audience is really interested in knowing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that experience of going to Sacramento was very, it was very transformational. Personally, being there on that day, it was a historic day, and even now, X amount of years later, like a few years later, about 2 weeks ago in California, there was a ongoing bill that was proposed in California that was initially vetoed by Governor Gavin Newsom, and it was different than what we were there in Sacramento for. That was specifically on overtime pay. And a couple weeks ago, they passed a bill that Governor Newsom finally signed that was about how unions for farm workers. It was the complexities of the bill. It's a little bit difficult to go through it all right now, but it was more about how farm workers can vote for union contracts, basically to start unions in fields. And he signed the bill, and it was I remember seeing that in the news, and it was very like full circle, because it was one step up. It was a piece of legislation that was one step up from what happened in our film. So, and I know California, the politics in California when it comes to farm workers, there is the most comprehensive legislation for farm workers, and around the country, if you go to some of these states like New York and in the Midwest, the legislation is, it's mirroring 1960s, 1970s stuff. And I always tell people people ask me, what is the state of the political state when it comes to legislation for farm workers in this country? And there's something that when I read it the first time, it struck me like to the core. And when I tell people, it seems that, I see jaws on the floor, and it's that really for the last 100 plus years, farm workers are the only labor force that have been completely excluded from any federal labor law, the only labor force. And that's kind of where I see the state, is that it is a constant struggle. And I learned that from the history of my grandfather, and I learned that from today, seeing the UFW still active in California, still active across the country, fighting for those same rights. Obviously, it looks a little bit different now, but when it comes to you were talking about like Gen Z and just advice or anything like that, I would just say that, the most important thing that I've seen in learning from my grandfather and his politics, and when it came to organizing, is that there's no, we can sign petitions, we can blast posts on social media, we can get celebrities to tweet something, we can get celebrities to show up places, we can do this, we can do that, but nothing replaces like mobilizing humans on the ground. That is the beauty of what my grandfather did. That is the beauty of what MLK did. That is, those are civil rights movements and how they were, how they started. They're organic and they started very, very small. It's very difficult in today's day and age with a lot of the access to different resources we have to think very large picture first. I think that is, it is very good to have large aspirations, but the work needs to be done on the ground. When it comes to, I've seen it firsthand when it comes to like electoral politics. I personally did a little bit of work on the Sanders campaign in 2020, supported Bernie in 2016, and did some work on his campaign in Iowa in 2020. And that was something that was also very transformative for me. Electoral politics has always been something that it's obviously they're very difficult to understand. And when I see grassroots movements that kind of like permeate electoral politics, like that Sanders campaign did in 16 and 20, that just gave me so much like vigor and motivation. And it was really beautiful, despite of how it turned out for his supporters. It was something that was very transformative and kind of just reminded me about what it takes. It's just really a constant, it's like a constant, it's constantly pushing that narrative forward and never really stopping. So yeah, and as far as the politics of the film go, there are a lot of elements that aren't formally said, but definitely after making this film, I see so much. Immigration was always a political issue that I was passionate about. The film definitely took that to a next level. I definitely believe that we need some serious immigration reform legislation for undocumented people in this country, pathway to citizenship. As far as like how my grandfather's politics kind of influenced, he was in a different time, obviously, and the political sphere looked very, very different. But what you cannot really take away and what hasn't changed is organizing on a grassroots level. I really truly believe that, at least for me, the politicians that I really get passionate about are the ones that are organizing on a grassroots level. They are not taking money from corporate America, and they are really just have they have the power of the people in numbers. And it's harder than ever to operate in electoral politics like that. That is, I may have a very kind of, rainbows and grassy meadows mentality. And I talked to my dad about it, who's very, very political, follows politics as I do as well. But he might be a tiny bit more cynical because he's seen more, but he does always come back to saying that, we're getting into a place in the political sphere where it's harder than ever to have our politicians stay away from big corporate money. It seems I had a political strategist, young Afro-Latinx kid, Ramon Contreras, on my podcast a couple months ago. He works in New York, and he said, he put it bluntly, like, our politicians are supposed to serve the people that are in their districts or whatever level of electoral politics they work on. And it seems that over the last 10 or 20 years that a political seat has become a stepping stone into like independent wealth. And that really undermines the idea of grassroots movements, very much so. So it's just, another reminder of how, we need to, if you're passionate about a cause, you need to just mobilize people and get as many people excited about change as you can. And it doesn't need to come from a formal organizer. That's what's the beautiful thing about my grandfather. He was not a formal organizer. He did have some training as an organizer, working for the CSO in Los Angeles and more of a city setting. But when it came to organizing farm workers in a rural setting, he was just about clueless, and he just had that great advantage of having worn the shoes of being a farm worker himself, knowing what their needs were and knowing how to connect with those people. And so, yeah, that's something that's kind of irreplaceable when it comes to organizing, is having kind of your ear to the ground and being very close to the cause is something that it really can't replicate.
I wanted to ask you a couple of questions as well, while we still have time, about filmmaking itself, and the stylistic choices you made in this film in particular. This is not just a piece of information, it's a piece of art, right? And so, I'm curious, there are a couple of things that really struck me. One of them was, when you introduced your grandfather's legacy to the viewer, you played a clip of Barack Obama speaking about his legacy, which is, a very controlled and purposeful way of telling a person's story, right? And then you were utilizing that within the film itself. I'm so curious about, like, how did you come to that kind of decision? And then the other one was, you used these animated reenactments that were very striking when discussing the past and showing the stories of your father and your grandfather. I was really curious how you arrived at those kinds of stylistic choices, and any others that maybe, I didn't notice.
Yeah, no, first of all, it's a great question. And it's one that it excites me because, like you said, it is a piece of information. It's like 61 minutes of a lot of different information that people can take in. But in the end, at first, it really is a piece of art, and telling the story in a certain way. Everything is so calculated, and some things are actually not so calculated. It's funny, when you put a film together, there's certain choices that are very much so very well thought out, and hours of cutting that scene. And then there's other things that you do by necessity because of, like, either a lack of resources, or you're trying to like make this like Lego set. Like the analogy I can use is of making a film is you're trying to put a puzzle together, but you're missing like 6 pieces, and then you're given just like a slab of wood and a knife to cut up your own pieces and try and make them fit. That's really what it is. It's not going into it. I think I had kind of a naive mentality of, it's a 50-piece puzzle and we're given all 50 pieces, but really as a filmmaker, you're not. So yeah, stylistically, the Obama one was, that was an interesting choice we made. I think at first it happens to do, one of the things was Obama was speaking, making La Paz, which is known as Keene, California, which was where the UFW headquarters was. That was, and where my grandfather lived and my grandmother till she passed away in 2016. That was turned in, I believe in 2018, into a national park by the Obama administration. And all my family was invited, and out of all the people, at least close family that I know, I was the only one that couldn't go. And I remember my brother being there and talking to me about how like captivating Obama was and like the power that he had as a speaker. I remember him calling me after that event, and he was standing right there, and he told me that he said that we had talked about, my brother and I, of like having the opportunity to just see in person, not even necessarily meet, but some very like iconic figures in their own world. And I've heard people say this about my grandfather. People say, I met your grandfather in this year, and when I met him, he had almost this, it was this like calm energy, this peacefulness that made him such a like overpowering figure, even though he was in stature only about 5'8". And I heard many people tell me that. And then one day I was in New Jersey with my dad as a little kid, and we went to watch a golf tournament, and I saw Tiger Woods walk by, and it was the same thing. It was these figures that are so iconic that they almost seem not real in person. My brother called me after Obama, gave that speech to make La Paz in California a monument or a national park. And he said the same thing about Obama. He had that same captivating speak and that aura, that glow about him, this sense of of calmness that it's almost like overbearing. He doesn't need to say anything to have a presence. And so when we were thinking about this time where we need to do a little, almost like a little intro to my grandfather and kind of say who he was, because you do kind of have to, when you make a film, despite the historical context, you have to kind of, kind of imagine, what if an alien sees this? Maybe someone is seeing this for the first time in a foreign country, or someone that is from the United States and doesn't know who my grandfather is, or just knows the name. And I thought, well, let's go back. I was like, let's go back to that footage. Let's try and find that footage of him making La Paz a monument. And the footage was difficult to find. And then we got that footage off of someone, I believe, in my family that shot it from the UFW. And when I watched it, I just immediately thought, this is perfect. Like, Obama is a very captivating speaker. He definitely has that energy. And really just the wording as far as the speech was written was perfect. It kind of goes from point A to point B, and it does mention, Si se puede, and that's obviously an iconic figure that was used as the slogan for the UFW. And so that choice, once we got that footage, we had that idea in so many drafts of the treatment and the script, as well as the editing. We'd put a placeholder and we'd say Obama speech. And we never could find the speech. We would keep editing the film. We were editing it around this, and we just had a black space there, just static Obama speech. And then finally, I'm like, I really hope that we find that actual footage, because it looks like I'm so dedicated to it that I thought we already had it. And then finally, we got it. The second I saw it, it just played so beautifully, and for timing perspective, it was perfect. So stylistically, we chose that. Animation, those stories that my father was telling were stories that no one really, other than people very close within the family, really that one story about the Peace Corps and my grandfather being offered the job from the Peace Corps. Very few people know that story other than my father, his father, who obviously, wasn't around when this film was, put out, and then my grandmother, who was also not around because she passed away in 2016, and so it was really just my brother and my father and his siblings, and I thought, okay, this is like very interesting stuff, because this is something that is history. It's like American history that nobody really knows, and I think it's very special, and we're very lucky to be able to do this. And so we were always from the beginning stylistically choosing the idea of, we wanted no formal interviews as far as like a talking head, and we cut as much in our own special way as possible. And I think the only ones that are in there is like my mom for about 15 seconds, and then my father, but he's cut in and out of some animation and some footage of like my dad and I walking around. So we had to keep those. But we never wanted to do the standard format of where you have a talking head and then you have archival footage, and then we shot it all to really have that like POV style. So it was like, okay, the stories my dad is telling, those are like gold from a storytelling perspective. Now, how do we bring this to life? And we, thought, okay, we're working around some certain, we have some restraints or some like constrictions when it comes to bringing these scenes to life. And we chose animation. We found a great animator in Los Angeles. And, I remember that process. I have now so much respect for what animators do. And especially that's like very like old school raw 2D animation. And I remember like every couple of days he would send us drafts, and it's just so, it's so intricate, and then to make them move. And I kind of like that it has that very like raw, almost 2D. It's like very old school, like original animation style. I like that, and the simplicity of it, I think, is very, very, very cool. And also, I've noticed that a lot of like when I've showed the film to kids that are very young, they really resonate with those images. So, yeah, stylistically, it was just about kind of making that multi-dimensional, making those scenes dynamic, and yeah, just being able to cut around it and kind of, you know, tell those stories. Yeah, as far as one other stylistic choice that I think that we made that was one that was difficult to make, because I guess as a filmmaker, you're making choices. The first order of business is, you know, stick with your gut and make choices that you believe in. You know, I never would want to put my name on something that I made where there's choices in there that I don't believe in. But then you also have to like have the humility to look back and understand that sometimes like what happens in this head right here in between my own ears isn't something an audience is going to resonate with. So we had a very collaborative team, and we like would vote on stuff and keep it. I like working that way and keep it open like that. And we came down to those farm worker scenes where I was kind of working through the fields. There was no narration. There was very little dialogue between me and the farm workers, and it was very slow. And I remember watching those scenes during the final edit and thinking, like, dang, this is too slow. Like this is the time when the audience might like get up and go to the bathroom. I don't want that. And then I remember having these conversations with my producing partner Cyrus, and he was like, well, we think about it this way, like we're trying to get an audience to be as immersed in this labor that they will never know. Very few people that watch this film. Some may have done that work, but very few people will have that idea of the monotony and the difficulty, like how arduous that labor is. And so I kind of turned to Cyrus and said, you know, I think that's great. We're going to let this breathe. We're going to make it very slow. And it's like, I would sometimes get uncomfortable with it because I'd be like, oh, when is the next piece of action happening? When's the next narration, or when's the next conversation? And I'd be like a little bit fidgety thinking, and I'm like, okay, no, I would like the audience to feel that way. I almost want it to feel like it's like like it's just slow. It's like pulling teeth. You're just like slowly going and trying to hopefully get that message across of that's what I had to do just for that month. But we have a labor force of 4 million people, I believe, in this country that do that for a lifetime.
So, you know, we're basically out of time, but I want to say, you know, in the Q&A, someone has written very helpfully. They've suggested, you know, if you're interested in golf and the lens of identity that you're looking through, maybe looking at someone like Lee Trevino and his story could be a very helpful avenue from which to tell some of your stories. And then, you know, I think we have just time for maybe just a last word, last idea that you may want to impart is related to this last question someone has that says, how does it make you feel to see so many individuals use the Si Se Puede slogan, including President Obama? Maybe you can tie that to like, okay, if you can put it very briefly, like big picture legacy takeaway, you know, seeing these things continue to today, but also, you know, even in your documentary, you point out that, oh, you know, the progress that I'm sure your grandfather was hoping for these farm workers is of course incomplete and not, you know, where he would have wanted it to be. Kind of, can you, you know, I'm sorry to ask you to do this so briefly, but be able to briefly just sort of say big picture takeaway about legacy there.
Yeah, of course. You know, that's like such a beautiful, and I do want to quickly remark that although it seems that history has attributed Si Se Puede to my grandfather, Cesar Chavez, Si Se Puede, that was actually a phrase that was coined by Dolores Huerta. She is actually the originator of the Si Se Puede. That was her. And it very much so encapsulates her. She's 92 years old and still very active as an activist and fighting for the rights of just equality for really everyone today. But yeah, I think that just really encapsulates like kind of my grandfather's legacy. You know, sometimes they say like when good things happen for people related to this legacy, it's like si se pudo. It's like, yes, we can, si se puede, si se pudo, yes, we could. And I think it really just comes down to like, what I learned about the legacy in my grandfather is that these ideas of social change, they move slowly, but you know, my grandfather, when it comes to a historical context, it seemed like he moved mountains, but really he was just a very ordinary person who had an extraordinary amount of perseverance within himself. And I think that's really what I've learned the most is that he was not the most charismatic speaker. He was really quite a shy person, but he did do extraordinary things and was able to really move mountains because he had such an undying passion for that cause of farm workers. And I think that's kind of what the legacy to me means. It's about like perseverance and pushing through. And si se puede is just, we can. And anybody that learns about this history or any other history of social justice, that's really the slogan that we should take, is that we can do it, and it is possible, just with a lot of dedication and a lot of perseverance.
Well, thank you, Eduardo. I really appreciate you sharing with us, such wonderful thoughts and insights to help us understand this piece of art that you've shared with us. That has really, I think, helped not only just us learn, but also, reflect and have a better understanding of history and ourselves. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. And thanks to everybody that got to see the film. I appreciate that as well.
With that, I'll turn it over to Dixiana.
Thank you again, Eduardo, for your time. Dr. Nakvi, again, too, for your time and your insightful questions. And thank you all that logged in. Also, those were some fascinating questions for Eduardo. So thank you all who participated. Again, I just want to thank our wonderful sponsors, the Office of the VP and Chief of Staff, and the Office of Equity, Education, and Administration. Without you all, it would not have been possible to bring in Eduardo to come and talk to us. But again, you all already know, if you want to learn more, Eduardo has his Latinx podcast. I know we put it in the chat. But yeah, please keep posted. LFSA has a lot of great upcoming events for our faculty and staff. But thank you all again, and have a great night. Buenas noches. Good night.